Hi, I'm Tanya Buxton and I'm at Killer Beauty HQ today, and I'm here just to guide you through some general sort of troubleshooting tips. So we all have trouble from time to time during our tattoo. Sometimes the skin is just really over-inflamed, or the pigment's not going in properly, or we have excessive bleeding and we just kind of can't figure out why. So this guide is just a bit of a general troubleshooting checklist to go through, which should eliminate what the problem is during your procedure and just allow you to carry on with your treatment with ease. One of the first things that I would check if I'm having any kind of troubleshooting during my tattoo is my needle. So I always check my needles before my procedure anyway. Things can still happen during the permanent makeup procedure. So any kind of troubleshooting, that's the first thing I will check first. So I'll grab my eye loop, double check the needle, make sure there's no kind of faults. Even just things like checking that my needle hang is enough. Maybe the needle hangs too short or too long, which is affecting my ink flow. It could even be that there's a bit of pigment, sort of dried up pigment that's clogging my needle, and that's affecting my ink flow. So just giving the needle a good check and just sort of eliminating any problems in that area is the first thing that I would do. The second thing to check would be your stretch. Sometimes we just need to get a better stretch on the client's skin. So I just kind of take a minute, assess where I am, like, am I comfortable where I'm sat around my client? Am I getting a good stretch on the skin? Can I kind of position myself differently to get a tighter stretch on that skin? If the skin isn't really taut, then the needle is not going to be able to implant the pigment like at its most efficient. So stretch is super important. So just take a minute and make sure that you've got a really good stretch, either your 3-point stretch or your V stretch, and just kind of mix it up, see what's working best. Another thing to check would be your technique. Am I using the right needle for my client's skin type? So if I'm dealing with an oily skin, for example, have I chosen the right needle and the right technique for that skin type? It could be that you need to potentially up your needle size to deal with a more difficult skin type and adjust your technique if needed to be able to implant the pigment into a more difficult skin type. Another thing to check technique-wise is your angle. Sometimes it could just simply be that we need to change the angle that we're tattooing at. So I find if we're tattooing at a higher angle, if we're whip shading, for example, if that's kind of not working, particularly with more difficult skin types, it could be just a simple adjustment of lowering that angle as you're tattooing. So just to bring that angle down and be able to implant more pigment at one time. Another thing to check technique-wise is your hand pressure. Again, it could just be something really simple that your hand pressure is just not enough for that skin type. So again, it's just taking that time, just kind of sit back for a second, assess things, going through your checklist, and yeah, just kind of think to myself, is my hand pressure right? Is my hand movement right as well? So particularly with oilier skin types and sort of scar tissue and more difficult skin types, we probably do want to slightly increase our hand pressure, lower our angle that little bit more, just to really allow for the pigment to implant like at its optimal level really. And if we're adjusting all of those things, we also then need to make sure that our machine and our volts and our speed and everything sort of coincides with that as well. So just kind of take a look at your general setup if you are going to change any of these little things to adjust. And that kind of brings me to the final things to check really. It is our equipment. So the first thing I would check would be my machine. Is my machine suitable for my setup? So if I've chosen a machine with a longer stroke length, so it has a little bit of a harder hit for my more difficult skin type, for example, or the fact that I'm using a larger needle configuration and I want that little bit of extra oomph behind my machine, so I've gone for a longer stroke length in my machine, I then need to make sure that my entire setup sort of coincides and suits that setup as well. So is my hand speed sort of coinciding with the fact that my machine is hitting that little bit harder? Is my speed coinciding with all of that as well? Just so everything is working in harmony. And also to make sure that the needle size that I'm using is suitable for this setup. So if I'm using a larger needle configuration, I would slow down So with a larger needle configuration, there's more surface area being penetrated at one time, so there's more resistance from the skin. So in order to allow for those needles to get to the depth in the skin that it needs to and successfully implant the pigment, it needs that little bit of extra time compared to, say, a single needle, which would sort of whip straight through like a hot knife in butter. So I need to make sure that the needle size I'm using is suitable for my machine setup, my hand speed, my hand pressure, and my volts, etc. And also to check your equipment. So sometimes a real simple fault in your equipment could be the culprit of troubleshooting while you're tattooing. It could be something as simple as a bit of a faulty connection, or even that, you know, your jack isn't in your power supply enough, or maybe your battery just needs clipping in to your machine a little bit better if the connection's just not quite 100%. It can sometimes be something as simple as that. So just check everything that you're using. Check all your connections, check any RCA cords to make sure that they're not kind of faulty or potentially need replacing. Also make sure that your machine is maintained, particularly the PMU pens. They are great and we don't have to maintain them like we do traditional coil machines in tattooing, but they do need a little bit of maintenance every now and then. So just double check that everything is kind of running as it should be and all your connections and things are running how they should be as well. I really hope this video was helpful. If you need any more advice or information, there are loads of free tutorials available on the Killer Beauty YouTube channel.